Brandywine. Now, as you can hear, Baltimore Pike is right behind me over here. It's loud, it's noisy. It's not like it was before. Now, what you see in back of me, it's a church. It's a Baptist church. Now, this church is not the original structure. This church was built in 1869. It's the Brandywine Baptist Church. Now, where we're at right now, from the Brandywine Creek, we're about a half a mile up Baltimore Pike. Now, where I'm standing, this is the National Historic Brandywine Battlefield. A little portion was donated to the state, and I'm on this area right now. There was in this general area where this church is, this is where the reserves would have been. It's questionable. They could have been in different areas, but the reserve was held back here in this area. Now, the church behind me dates back to 1715. It was a log church. It was made out of logs. Now, the cemetery off to the other end is original. The graves date back to about the 1760s, maybe even further back. Some of the tombstones are that you can't read them. On this spot, on September 10th, probably in the morning time, the soldiers came around this general area where a preacher gave a sermon to the troops because they knew on September 11th that the British were amassing on the other end of the creek. They were coming up. Now, a lot of these soldiers had a lot of faith. They thought that they were going to survive this battle. This was Washington's biggest army during the Revolutionary War. He had about 11,000 guys here with weapons. Most of the other guys were usually people like drivers and different people that followed the army. Washington never had an army like this again at Brandywine. Now, on this spot where the church is now, like I said, a preacher in the early mornings of September 10th, he preached to them. He stood on a pulpit, probably right out front here, and he explained what the day was going to be like the next day. He told them that most of you will not survive. Now, we might have heard this before in different types of TV programs, that during war, they have to explain that a lot of these guys are going to die. But he said that your faith will set you free. He said a lot of other things. He stood up on the pulpit for about an hour and gave his sermon right in this church behind me. Now, thinking back today, we're looking at faith and how it plays a major role in the way combat is made. Now, this church would have been part of that combat. They preached to them. They said different things to them. They tried to build their spirits. Now, these guys at Brandywine, they were probably poorly clothed. They came from different backgrounds. Most of them were immigrants. They were German, English, Irish, Dutch. It was a ragtag of different guys that were in Washington's army. He most likely probably had blacks that fought alongside the army. So everybody had different faiths. But back then, faith played a major role in people's lives. There was a church in a lot of these communities where these people came from. They came to the church, and it was part of like their social environment. So when they assembled here, they knew that their faith would carry them through the next day during the battle. You know, thinking back, you see graves back there. I would suggest that most likely there are people that died on this battlefield that are buried in the churchyard here, that died at Brandywine. Most likely there could be British back there. They don't know. Now, from my travels around the battlefield and talking to people and knowing different areas, that only when the army was moving in quick succession, they didn't bury the dead properly. Now, after this, the British were encamped in this general area. They would have had tents around the church. They would have used the church as a hospital. It was made of logs. Now, when people died in the hospital, they weren't just thrown out the back door. They were buried in the cemetery, just like all the other inhabitants. Now this happened with a lot of structures. It didn't just happen with churches. It happened with people's homes. It happened with different meeting houses where the dead were buried a little bit further away from the structure. And you know, Brandywine battlefield today is a battlefield that it suffered with the cutbacks from state and federal governments. This battlefield that we're on today was slated to be closed permanently. And it was only through the donations of local residents that this battlefield stays open. Now, unfortunately, right now the battlefield is closed. It's closed during the winter time to cut back on cost. But it is open during the summer and fall. They have reenactments here. And it's an area that is well steeped in a lot of traditions. The encampments are real. The people are real. They feel like they're real Continentals when they reenact in this area. Now this church was pivotal in the faith and overall well-being of soldiers. They would have slept here on the ground. They would have had their knapsack under their head as a pillow. And they would have thought behind them that maybe that their faith would carry them through this battle. But a lot of guys didn't make it. A lot of guys died. Now, there's not really a lot of marked graves for people that died. Very few and far between. So I guess if these Americans died and the British took this area, they probably just let the Quaker inhabitants bury the dead. The British didn't worry about the Americans. But most likely, over in the cemetery over there, there's British dead buried. Now, today, we see a landscape here that's a little different. A lot of trees have grown. There's a lot of change here. Now, is change good for a battlefield? Now, we look at that today with some of our Civil War battlefields. A lot of times when people go to a battlefield, it's a trip. They go on their own. Now when people go on trips, they take their kids with them. They take their families with them. So if it's a trip, most likely they want to eat out. They want to eat at restaurants. They want to go shopping. So a lot of strip malls and fast food places have popped up all over the region. Not in this general area, but the Gettysburg battlefield. There's hotels, there's everything, which takes away from the battlefield. Now they do try to preserve a little bit, but we're losing our battlefields faster than anything. Now this general area is protected. The people that own the land around here are very stringent about who comes on their land. They won't sell their land to developers. The local and state governments have a beautification act here, where you can't sell your land. It's pretty much, it has to be a certain degree of farmland, and it has to be in a certain way. They won't even allow plastic play sets here because it takes away from the natural beauty of the area. Now, Brandywine battlefield extends for about 15 square miles from where I'm standing in every direction. Now this is threatened. A lot of McMansions were put up on the battlefield in certain areas of the township. Now where I'm standing, there's 3 townships. There's Pennsbury Township, there's Chadds Ford Township, there's Birmingham Township. Each one of these has their own rules and regulations about where they're going to put houses up. Some are stricter than others. But this area stays the same. The church in back of me is a Civil War church, or a little bit after. And I just want to mention that a prayer was here by a preacher. But the sad part about this is that this preacher did not survive the battle. He was killed. He was killed on the battlefield. Now you think of him picking up a gun, but most likely he had to. He had to fight for what he believed in. He died for what he believed in. But on this spot, he made a stand. And his own faith carried him through. But he was killed on the battlefield on September 11th, 1777.